Arthurian myth is the stuff of legend in the most literal way possible. And yet, with so many retellings and such a long history across so many parts of Europe, there are characters and stories which change or are left out in popular retellings. One such character is the mythic Black Knight. And today we're doing something a little different on this episode of It Belongs in a Museum. I am joined by our resident mythology expert, Alan.
Well,
He will actually be the one who did the research this time, not me, and he's going to tell both me and you, the listener, about this Black Knight character. I have done no research, he has done all of the research, and we're going to talk about an element of modern mythology that is often overlooked. So I give the floor to you.
yeah. So, what's fascinating about Arthurian myth is, Arthurian legend rather, is the characters and their relationships kind of shift sometimes, or like because they've been in so many retellings, depending on the depiction. It's fascinating. Not to mention, there's a whole lot of like the weird, like a lot of the stuff we get, I think, from like standard like Witcher style weird witchcraft stuff, outside of the folklore that one's based on, but that sort of like dark folklore comes from the sort of Christianization of like the mythology coming Celtic style mythology coming into Arthurian legend, given where the British Isles where it was set.
Hmm.
So it's a fascinating where like because like in the standard one I have that's like almost every Arthurian story because it's the more like Catholicized edited version. Gawain the Green Knight isn't in there. I had to get a separate book for that because it's too overtly like the weird fairy stuff.
So as the myths continued and they interfered with Catholic areas, they would gentrify it
Mm-hmm.
and take out
Mm-hmm.
some of the less
Which is
desirable
interesting.
elements.
He's so King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table are so inherently tied to like God and like Christianity. It doesn't
Hmm.
occur to you how much has been worked out of it until you were really looking
And
into
was
it.
it always that way? Even like in the earlier versions, was he a sort of
From what, and that's
Christian
where it gets
figure?
interesting because that's where you go far enough back. There's the rumors about whether or not he was actually based off a real king. Some even say he was inspired by like people like Alexander the Great and was based off those conquerors.
Oh, I
But
should mention, you may sometimes hear interference from Gigi the cat. There's a sort of a ticking time bomb situation here where I am horrifically allergic to cats, and my friend Alan has a cat. So you may from time to time hear meowing and purring or just someone knocking something over, and that's because cats cannot be trusted. Anyway, as you were saying about Alexander
uh,
the Great.
so basically, the sort of legend, as it were, of King Arthur has sprawled and adapted over so many times it can be difficult to trace the specifics, and the Black Knight is no different. In fact, there are many different identities to the Black Knight, but the initial ones that are nameless are usually because whatever protagonist is fighting them kills them swiftly enough that they don't bother being given a name. Because you also say, and then the Red Knight hops down to fight him as well. So
Ah,
that's more of a generalized, probably not the actual Black Knight that we're thinking of.
okay. So it was just a term for a villainous
Yes, or sometimes it's
character.
just a descriptor for
Hmm.
what the color of their armor to set them apart. So you could say, and then he killed this guy, he killed that guy, and he killed that guy. Because one of the things that's kind of funny about Arthurian legend is that there's kind of a weird, with the lack of a better term, almost in like my OC is better than your OC type ism within each installment.
Ah, okay. So the idea that when someone creates a brand new character, they make that character better than the last character that was
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
introduced.
And they specifically, some of them exist specifically to succeed at things that the last one failed at.
Wow.
Yeah,
So in a way, Tumblr is the modern Arthurian myth.
in a way.
Boy,
But
I don't like
before
that.
I get into that, I want to talk about the two confirmed identities that could be the Black Knight.
Okay.
The first one is King Pellinor or Pellinor. He is the most likely candidate. He's referred to at first as the Sable Knight, which is the sort of old-timey term for black.
Okay.
And I'll get in more into him later
All
because
right.
I think he is the best fit for it. The other one is Lancelot during the Vulgate cycle or the quest for the Holy Grail.
Interesting.
However, I think this is the result of the my OC is better than your OC because that's when they introduced Galahad, who is the one who's supposed to be better than him, and Lancelot spends the whole time basically getting like, and when he gets close to the Holy Grail, it basically blasts him with divine light. And when he talks to a priest, he's like, "Well, it's because you want Guinevere. You're too bad a person."
Yeah, I was wondering if
And
that how it was going to
meanwhile,
tie into the love triangle of King Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot.
meanwhile, Galahad, his illegitimate son, is so pure and so good that the person writing it one-upped every person so that no one could top him because that story ends with him not only finding the Holy Grail, but being so pure and so good about it that angels come down and take him to heaven with the Holy Grail.
So it's sort of like how Dante's Inferno was just a big ego stroke.
Mm-hmm. In a
Okay.
way, but what's interesting about Arthurian legend is outside of Galahad, who was unique in that level of purity, every other Arthurian character possesses some flaw that is ultimately their downfall, almost like a ticking time bomb.
Which I think from a writing standpoint is more interesting,
Mm-hmm.
and I think maybe why some of those characters have endured a
And
little
I
bit
think
more in media.
and I think that's what contributes a lot to its sort of Gothic style, along with, Catholic architecture. So the one that I think is the most likely candidate for the actual identity of the Black Knight is King Pellinore, and that's
Okay.
the one I want to focus for this because I think Lancelot was dressed in black during the Vulgate cycle because he was going to be like, well, he's bad in this. We're
So
going to
so why
show he's
don't
a
you real
bad
quick
person.
Lancelot's arc there, why don't you briefly, for people who don't know, just kind of briefly explain what that was?
All right. So basically, Galahad shows up and is brought into the round table,
Hmm.
and that's sort of what kicks us off because he sits in this chair that he's not supposed to sit in because only the knight destined to lead them to the Holy Grail is supposed to sit there. And if anyone else sits in there, they die. He sits in it and he's fine. So, like, oh, you're the guy who's going to lead us to the Holy Grail.
Interesting.
And so the hunt for the Holy Grail begins, and it follows a bunch of different adventures from different characters during the Vulgate cycle of each person and their misadventures and their end of hunting for the Holy Grail.
And it's interesting that the Holy Grail is an object of search within Arthurian myth, but was also in real life something that the real Catholic Church was genuinely looking for in the
Hmm.
time that, a lot of this would be fictionally set as well.
Yeah.
I just want to point out that would be sort of like if we were writing fiction at the time about like hunting bin Laden at the time when we were actually looking for him. Like
Yeah, it's wild.
it's a weird like fictional
Oh,
version of what's
I
happening.
could go on and on about the weird OC, like we're gonna show how great we are type of stuff that like the Legend of King Arthur does.
All right,
It's
but
fascinating.
Lancelot going dark side on this, like kind of
It's
having
just representation of how one is the whole OC thing, but two, it's because his even though he hasn't done anything with Guinevere, it's the fact that he's in love with Guinevere, and that's King Arthur's wife, and the
yeah.
fact is like, hey, that's bad, but that's a whole other mess to get into.
Yeah, I've heard versions where the Lancelot thing doesn't really start to metastasize until after Arthur is gone, and then like obviously it depends on who's telling the
Hmm.
story. But I know much less about Arthurian myth
Well,
than
there's a
you.
lot of evolving accounts too. It's
Yeah.
fascinating.
So he was kind of in his you're not the main character
Hmm.
thing.
And that's where what a lot of them went through. And that's what's fascinating, and what will make the Black Knight interesting as I go into it, because it's important to note that any character, once they are sort of in their OC era, as it were, they're the protagonist, they don't really lose. They suffer the
Interesting.
consequences of their flaws, but even when suffering mortal wounds, they usually come out on top.
Gigi, my God, you
You
were dive bombing
you
my feet.
don't see them lose, really, which is
Hmm.
what makes the Black Knight interesting, specifically the King Pellinore one, because he's an exception to that rule.
Okay, we'll continue then.
The first entry of the Sable Knight, as he's known, is so there's this person basically expecting taxes from people as they walk by.
Hmm.
A sort of squire that's named Sir Griflet asks to become a knight. So King Arthur says, sure, if you go and deal with this guy who's expecting people to pay to go through this on our kingdom, you can become a knight. Get your stuff and go fight him. And he goes to joust with this knight dressed in, known as the Sable Knight, which is just black. So he's the
Hmm.
Black Knight, just in old-timey terms. They joust, and Sir Griflet is mortally wounded and sent back, and King Arthur immediately has him like tended to as the best that he can do to make sure he turns out okay. But now King Arthur's like, all right, give me my best stuff, and
Oh.
I'm gonna go face this guy. And again, this is during the King Arthur protagonist era, so like it's about to go down.
Yeah, he's not expected to lose,
No. And he on his way he Merlin tags along,
as he
and
does.
there's a whole thing I could get into there, but that would take too long of a side tangent to get into what happened there. But so him and Merlin show up, and the Sable Knight does what he did with the last guy, which is challenge him to a joust.
Hmm.
And they consistently are evenly matched, breaking the joust, the sort of what's the term? I just lost the term for the jousting thing.
The
Lances.
lance.
Their lances consistently break on each other, showing that they're evenly matched
Hmm.
over and over and over again, until finally the Black Knight knocks Arthur off of his horse,
Hmm.
which at the time was also considered sort of metaphorical for if this had been a real fight, you would be dead.
Yeah.
Which King Arthur doesn't like the idea of his mortality, and he certainly
Yeah.
doesn't like being reminded of it.
No.
So he consistently, after any time the things would smash, would be like, "Fight me," and he'd be like, "No, more jousting." Has his squire bring out more things for jousting. Finally, King Arthur forces him to get into a proper sword duel, at which point he's described as actually being very big and imposing.
Hmm.
And during their duel, he destroys King Arthur's sword, the one from the stone.
Oh, so that one.
Yeah, that's why he needs Excalibur, because he destroys that and he's about to kill him. Then Merlin's like, "Wait, that's King Arthur." And he's like, "Wait, that's King Arthur? Well, I'm not gonna let him live. He's the king. He's gonna send everyone after me." So he tries to kill him anyway. Merlin has to put like a sleep spell on him and knock him out to save Arthur. And Arthur's like, "I can't believe I had to win in a way that was so shameful." So then Merlin has to go and take him to get Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake. And as they return to where he is, Merlin has it where the Sable Knight won't see them.
Hmm.
As King Arthur's like, "Well, I want to fight him." I was like, "No, you shouldn't fight him." I was like, "Why not?" Because eventually he's going to be valuable to the Round Table, and his sons will be as well.
Interesting. So
Well,
Merlin knows some type of prophetic
he's always
use.
person with like in touch with the future, and I could get into a whole thing about like how dubious he is as a character and how he's manipulating things with how he sees the
It might be
future.
interesting to do a Merlin episode in the future.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Uh, but so Merlin makes it so that the Sable Knight doesn't see them as he rides by, and for a while that's all we hear of him. However, that's not our first encounter with him in reality, because as he reveals that the Sable Knight's name was King Pellinore, Arthur had met King Pellinore before.
Hmm. And this is in one version where he is revealed to be King Pellinore. Like they
Mhm.
confirm it in one
That
version.
is in the Sable Knight proper
Okay.
thing. I don't know if there are other interpretations where the person in that position is someone else. I've only read the version where it is King Pellinore at that stable doing that.
Okay.
What makes it more interesting is King Pellinore continues to exist as the person who surpasses King Arthur at things because there's a creature called the Questing Beast, a very
Mm.
bizarre, sort of fever dream-like creature.
Well, what were the? Because I remember we were talking to someone and they said that they thought that perhaps it was based on like a giraffe that someone had
Yeah,
seen.
because it's described as having the body of a leopard, but like also hooves and the head of a snake and the tail of something that would basically give it a giraffe's tail.
Interesting. But they
Others,
were just didn't know what a giraffe was.
it's possible, and it is, and giraffes are actually quite fast. And the whole
Yeah.
thing is that King Arthur is so obsessed with catching this questing beast once he sees it, because it's so bizarre and majestic that even when he's resting after chasing it, he dreams of it, and it just keeps driving. And like I said, King Arthur doesn't like losing, so he's obsessed with
Sort of
finding
like
it.
an Ahab type obsession.
He literally, and this is common within the era, rides, but it takes, extreme circumstances. He rides the horse to the point it dies of exhaustion. He has
That's
to get
horrible.
yeah.
Well,
Again,
that
common with
makes
the
it
era.
like almost every episode we've done so far where a horrible thing happens to a horse. I swear, we love animals. In real life, we love
Even
animals.
when they mess with our audio.
Yeah, Gigi, you got to stop dive bombing, girl.
Uh, but as the squire is bringing him a new horse, King Pellinore shows up and is like, "Hey, I've been chasing this beast even longer than you have." It's like, "Well," and they're basically like, "Well, I want to catch her." It's like, "Well, I've been chasing it longer, and I've rode my horse to the point it died of exhaustion." The squire brings the new horse. King Pellinore hops on. It's like, "Sorry, but it's my catch," and rides off on King Arthur's new horse the squire just brought him. And King Arthur just basically looks back at the squire and is like, "Go get me another new horse."
That's wow.
At which point Merlin basically confronts him with some weird, like, he has a way of having double standards with people and challenging people, especially
Mm.
King Arthur, and he does basically something like that there. That's less relevant to the King Pellinore thing, but then basically he's like, "Look, don't worry about the questing beast thing. What's interesting about the questing beast thing?"
Oh, there's more to it. I've never heard more beyond
Oh, yeah.
this.
You see, later, after King Pellinore joins the Round Table, like he prophesied, he is described during the battle against Nero and King Lot of Orkney as fighting alongside the questing beast like it's his hunting dog
So
now.
he's not only captured, like he didn't just catch up, he tamed it.
Yes. And the person that Arthur sleeps with that gives birth to Mordred, the person that's destined to kill him,
Mm-hmm.
he eventually marries and has sons with. So
Ah.
every time Arthur makes some sort of misstep or something, King Pellinore shows up and is like, "I'm going to succeed where you failed."
Also, I want to point out, it's not fair that Lancelot was judged by God for wanting to have like to sleep with Guinevere.
Oh, that's a whole
But
thing.
then King Arthur's just stepping out like a floozy.
And that was before he'd even married Guinevere.
Yeah,
And and it
I'm
did
just
cause
saying
him
there's
to
some double
it did
standards.
cause the birth of the person who's destined to kill him.
Well, yeah, there were repercussions, but
But
that's
what's also it is interesting because he he basically exists, which I think is that makes that why I've been calling him the Sable Knight rather than the Black Knight, because I think the character of King Pelion or the Sable Knight is far more interesting than the Black Knight, who's just a generalized evil guy. Because, like I said, the nameless Black Knights, they died almost instantly. They were just
yeah,
cannon fodder. But a version who exists not only as like a weird foil, but one who surpasses someone whose whole thing is he doesn't like losing.
yeah.
Not to mention just someone who can tame a weird questing beast creature, one of the only really unique weird creatures within Arthurian legend, and he tames it.
I mean, I can't really think of an example in recent media that does you're following a protagonist or a group of protagonists,
Hmm.
and they're generally going to win because that's the way the plot usually unfolds in those types of stories. They don't generally introduce a character who shows up and is just better than everyone else and is also sometimes at odds with them and frustrating. Like you don't get what maybe Dragon Ball.
Maybe. But
I
even that, they usually come around and win before they and
well,
defeat
or
them
they
before they
just
join
join
them.
up and
And
become
he did do
friends.
the joining up thing, but like usually I feel like most of the time in those sorts of stories where it's a power creep type thing, they have to defeat them as well to show that like, well, they're
Yeah, I
still
guess
more
that's true.
powerful.
Even
But King
Dragon
Arthur
Ball,
didn't beat King
yeah,
Pelion,
he's
which is
just
what makes it
consistently outclassed.
which is what makes their dynamic so interesting because he's also a king and he's someone who surpassed him in specifically the ways where he fails. And I think that makes him way more interesting than just the generalized Black Knight, even though he's the most logical one to be the Black Knight.
It makes you wonder why in all of the mythology it's like Arthur is so great. From what I believe, it's even after he was about to die, he's not even really dead, and he'll come
Hmm.
back someday.
That's why
It's
he's
like,
called like the once and future king.
and yet we don't really. If there's a better king, I wouldn't even be betting on King Arthur. Like if there's of King Pelion, what's his name?
Pellinor, or
Pelion.
sometimes it's Pellinor. Again, this is one of those things with
King
astrology.
P, the Sable Knight. I'd be banking on that guy. Be like, I'll follow you. You have the weird questing beast. You
And he
have,
didn't even have a magic sword.
yeah. He's just a guy who's good
Because
at
by
that.
that point, King Arthur had Excalibur, which kept him alive and like heals him.
Wow. So I don't want to get you too off topic, but well, the first time you and I talked about King Arthur a long time ago was because of the Guy Ritchie movie, King Arthur:
Hmm.
Legend of the Sword. Do you think they were kind of taking the more villainous Black Knight stuff, and that's kind of what they gave Jude Law's character?
It's hard to say. The
Because they were
whole
kind of rejiggering the
there
dynamics
were a
yet
lot of
again.
dynamics moving around. I don't know. I don't know enough about like the potential. I tried to find as much as I could on Arthurian legend, and I've been doing that for ages, well before this. But so I don't want to just say, well, I don't know anything. Like obviously that was pulled from nowhere. That was pulled from nowhere. Because yes, the names existed, but I don't know how. Like the guy who has a vendetta against a specific person, I don't know if that was a thing.
I
I don't
guess
know
I
how
would
much of
say,
it was.
but to curtail this little side tangent, Charlie Hunnam as King Arthur, how do you think he lived up
I
to the
think in
myths?
terms of like appearance and strength, I think 100%. And just because they're characters like with any sort of legend or mythology, everyone kind of has, like with Robin Hood or anyone, you kind of have your own idea in your head of how you think they act in any given situation.
Yeah,
So while I personally have a different idea of how I think King Arthur might act in any given situation, depending on sort of what arc he's in or whatever,
yeah,
I think that one's really interesting. It's also fascinating because, canonically, yes, King Arthur started from like sort of small beginnings. But he was still within nobility.
yeah.
So it's already
So
kind
Guy
of
Ritchie kind of
he
muddied
gave
him up
yeah, he
more.
made him grittier and a man of kind of almost Hooded him. And sometimes Robin Hood is from nobility in some
Yeah,
versions, in other
I
times
would
he's a
really
man of the
like to have
people.
seen what his version of this sort of like of the love triangle and like of
Yeah.
the Sable Knight. That would have been.
I mean
I
the
enjoyed that movie immensely when it came
yeah,
out.
and what I think I even said and when we reviewed it, the stuff I liked the most was the stuff that departed from it because it was so fascinating to see delving into like the weird version of their like folklore and like weird Celtic witchcraft stuff was so fascinating and creative that it was almost more enjoyable than just seeing the Arthur myth itself since there was already a change to the origin and stuff like that.
And like you were saying before, that would mean that it was kind of going back to its earlier versions before the Catholic Church
Hmm.
sterilized it more and took kind of
Potentially, yeah.
the creepiness
Pulling
out.
it back into its folklore, but although yeah, it's pulling it back into its folklore, but keeping the creepiness that the Catholics tried to infuse that folklore with to make people stay away from it.
Yeah, so anyway, so but to your back to your Sable Knight and the fact that his so it's not his biological son, but he raises the son that would eventually mortally wound or kill Arthur.
Effectively, yeah.
fascinating.
It's truly intriguing. And again, because they're shifting, like I said, Gawain starts off as King Arthur's nephew, but sometimes he's referenced as his son. There's all sorts of shifting relationships like
Hmm.
that.
They're more of an archetype where their connections, like I believe even within Norse mythology, Thor is sometimes a brother of Odin and not just his son.
Mm.
And like they all
It's
have kind of like multiple names they can be called by.
Yeah. And so it's one of those things where like things kind of shifted from book to book and
Hmm.
such.
And retelling to retelling,
Yeah.
locations, geography,
And
culture.
even like I said, even within the source material, you're talking about like, oh well, how close can we get the source material? That's what makes it tricky because while there are historical inspirations, we don't, and there are even people who theorize that maybe King Arthur was based off an existing king at the time. We don't really know for sure because of how much the legend took hold of things and like how much it took over and how long it was considered just to be their history for a while.
Which is kind of bananas. I mean,
Yeah.
I understand that education was different all those years ago, right? But
Hmm.
the idea that somebody be like, there are dragons and there's a mage named Merlin and there's like ladies in a lake that will give you a sword.
Hmm.
Like to just consider, I guess, as I say it, I look at the current state of things and I do see people being stupid and superstitious. So I guess it's maybe not quite as alien to me as I would like to believe that it is. But
Hmm.
if someone said, "Did you know that dragons are real? They're in our history books." I would be very confused. I would have some questions. I would
Yeah.
want some peer-reviewed studies. Obviously, that wasn't a thing there, and sadly, doesn't feel like it's as much of a thing anymore. So it's it's such a strange merging of these characters were looking for things that in real life the church was really looking for, and it was also sometimes taught as though it was real history, and
Hmm.
sometimes it was just myth. It's so interesting to see the way that fiction and reality they can cross the threshold back and forth
And
so
like,
frequently.
I'd love to see an authentic adaptation of like its world and stuff because it does so many fascinating stuff and just throws out some really crazy, interesting stuff. Because even though stuff like the questing beast is one of its only real like monsters,
Hmm.
there are other like aren't a whole lot in the way of like special like fantastical creatures of any kind.
Hmm.
Aren't a whole lot. There are some, but
Interesting.
not a whole lot. But it's still really fascinating and it definitely set the precedence and I think the standard for like the sort of D&D. You find a magic item, it has these properties and these rules. A lot of the swords and stuff have those properties with the
And like you could
characters.
look at the works of like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and
Mm.
how, I mean, I know that if memory serves, it was Tolkien who was like, I will not write dwarfs, it's dwarves with a V.
Mm.
So there are obviously iterations and changes,
Yeah.
but I mean, I've even seen directors like American directors who were hesitant to adapt the Arthurian myth because they're like, well, I mean, it's not really my myth. It's from another land. Like I almost like people kind of want to reinterpret it as like a Wild West movie or something like to Americanize it because it feels almost wrong to touch something so closely bound to the British Isles
Hmm.
and something that is, I mean, it really is foundational there. And it's something you see with America where because it is such a melting pot of like European immigrants and people just traveling and looking for a new life we get a mixing of mythologies from other places, but there isn't a ton of mythology
Yeah.
born from this land that isn't just Native American.
Can you imagine if we had a King Arthur equivalent based off Washington?
That would be fascinating.
That would
Yeah,
be
that would have been
wild.
great. That would have been really interesting to look at.
He
And
pulled the cutlass from the stone.
yeah, he got his wooden teeth from the Lady in the Lake or something.
Hmm.
Like just the most ridiculous because it's fun to look back at the way that we prop up our heroes, but to look back on history and be like that's fun.
Yeah.
I know I try not to. I guess if we're talking about fiction, it doesn't matter. But Assassin's Creed 3 had the tyranny of King Washington
Yeah.
alternate history thing that they did, and that's like you know in another world, perhaps we would have had like if we had been an oligarchy, perhaps we would have had mythologies about our founding
Hmm.
tyrants instead of the founding fathers. But in a way, we get to have connections to all of the mythologies. So many cultures have intermingled,
Hmm.
and yet none of them are inherently any of ours because we're sort of
Yeah.
this people out of time
Yeah.
with unless you can trace your lineage back to the original people who lived on this land, you can't really point to a geographic location and say, I have a myth from here that's in my blood. Whereas
Yeah.
if you're Jason Statham, or Charlie Hunnam maybe would be the more apt comparison here. And you're in the UK, you can point to things and say there's a myth about this place and that's
Yeah.
my forefathers.
Yeah.
that's a fascinating dynamic, and it changes kind of, I think, the perception of the culture and of the myth.
Yeah.
So is that sort of the larger strokes of the Sable Knight, or is there more that you wish to
That's
impart?
that's basically the sum of it, and I think that the Black Knight probably was came from the element that like he eventually just got delineated to this antagonist who seeks to undermine people
Hmm.
to the point that because his big thing was win against someone who normally never loses, I think that's probably what set the stage for sort of Darth Vader like character that exists to make you scared,
Yeah,
and that eventually became the sort of the sort of got delineated down to what we know it as.
it's interesting to think that this is almost a point in literature, in early literature, where you go from I've invented a character and they will never fail, and you start seeing no, they're going to struggle, they're going to fall,
Hmm.
but eventually they'll get up again and potentially lead you into something
And
really great.
And like I said, this is the only what makes this interesting is he's the only exception of a character during his sort of like he's the protagonist era failing at something. It's the only example of that. Every other character, if they're in their protagonist era, they're not losing at something unless it's their flaw catching up with them.
Oh wait, do you hear someone's trying to land on the free? Oh my gosh, it's Illinois Jackson. Hello, boys. I'd like to know if you found a myth that should be in my museum. Did you find anything that belongs in a museum? Uh, let me ask Alan. What do you think? Do you think that the Sable Knight deserves a plaque or some type of suit of armor modeled after his myth in the wing of Illinois Jackson's legally distinct museum?
Yes, and all of his potentially dubious existence, whether or not he may or may not have been based off something real.
Okay, guys. Well, I'll go ahead and I'll get the guys working on I'll put them in the southeast corner. I'm gonna get back in my plane. All right. Safe travels, Illinois. Anyway, I agree. It does belong in a museum. So thank you for being kind of the pilot of this.
Sure
Well, I
thing.
wish as the passenger.
It was fun to go back to it for the purpose of like distributing specific information.
And so I hope you all enjoyed this mythical dance into the world of fiction and how it's changed so much. And maybe we'll do this, every couple episodes. We'll just have you come in and talk about a myth and how it's impacted human culture. That could be fun.
Yeah.
So thanks for watching. And the Sable Knight does belong in a museum. Safe travels, Illinois. Oh God, oh God. Pull up.